Hello, welcome. This is the second episode in our series, The Science of Effective Prevention. Our first episode, we talked about the economics of addiction and the industry of addiction. Lots of new information. And today we're going on and we're going to talk primarily on the costs. What are the costs to society of this industry of addiction, which is operating in our society, and how does it impact our efforts at effective prevention? So the cost to society that are spent treating the disease of addiction drain our community resources, and as a result, our efforts of prevention don't have as many resources as they otherwise would, and they suffer, and that's unfortunate. So we do know from Iceland that if we invest in resources, if we invest our resources into prevention, that we can essentially eliminate the epidemic of addiction. We can turn the battleship. And this is such profound information. So in Iceland, they had the worst levels of alcohol and drug abuse. And at the end of 10 years, they had changed from the worst place to the best place in all of Europe. They ended up closing 4 out of 6 rehabs, and they invested in their whole science of prevention and their prevention model. And they also were able to control their industry in a way that was helpful for society, and we're going to look at that right now. Now, there's some myths that the industry would not like you to be aware of. And the first is there's nothing we can do about addiction rates, that essentially 10% of the population is going to be an addict no matter what you do. And they say that, there's nothing we can do about the levels of addiction because it's really dependent on someone's genes. If they're destined to be an addict, because of their genes, they're going to be one, and there's nothing we can do. And therefore, we need to focus our efforts on, prevention, on treatment of people who are suffering, rather than on societal changes in the environment that encompass really prevention, the science of prevention. So what we learn from Iceland is that we look at this model and we see over 20 years that the genetics in Iceland have not changed. So they didn't have a gene pool shift that magically all of a sudden made it so that 10% of the population, that the percentage of people who are suffering from addiction changed. What they changed was the money and resources that they put into prevention efforts, and that decreased their rates of addiction in their society. The other thing that people in Iceland are quick to say is that Iceland has high rates of single-parent homes. They work long hours outside the home. They have lots of use of anti-anxiety psychiatric drugs. They have high screen times. So all of these, they're not unique. High mortgage rates, high credit card debts. So it's not some sort of ideal society, but they were able to invest in prevention and make a profound difference. So that's cause for a lot of hope. So now we'll just review some of the central premises that we talked about on the first program. And we talked a lot about this quote from the RAND report of Bo Kilmer's. The daily and near daily users account for 80% of alcohol and drug expenditures. And in order to create a profit, these companies are expected to focus on creating and maintaining these heavy users. Dependence is good for the bottom line. So again, this is quite a devastating concept that we are enabling an industry which its widget that it's producing is actually someone who has a substance abuse disorder. And so that's really a new concept for a lot of Vermonters when they hear it. We had no idea that this was happening, that they don't make any profit unless they create heavy users. So that's important information. And then the second part of the quote is also important. Our free speech doctrine makes it very difficult to restrict advertising and marketing, and we've seen that play out in the marketplace. And when we legalize an industry, when we give them personhood and legitimacy, then we give them certain rights, and those rights make it very difficult to control advertising and marketing to children, and producing modifications of their product which are more dangerous, more addictive than they would otherwise be. So there's the slide on showing that the taxes are not able to keep up with the costs of addiction. And the next slide shows, so the next slide that you're looking at there is a representation of the river is on fire, and all of a sudden people pay attention that they're taking care of the costs while the industry is going away with the profits. And then the next slide is the representation of the small amount of taxes that we are able to actually collect, but the costs to society are 10 times that. So we see we have historical data on alcohol and tobacco, and today we're going to take a deep dive into marijuana, but the principles are the same for all the different substances. And then the next slide. So what are the costs to society? Today we'll explore the cost of one drug, marijuana, and compare those costs to society to the taxes that society is able to collect from the industry's earned profit. And can taxes be collected to mitigate the damage the industry creates as they create and maintain heavy users in their efforts to secure industry profit? And the very last part of our program, we'll really look deeply at what of the human suffering. You know, there's the cost and monetary, but what of the human suffering? And then our last slide, so this talk is going to talk primarily about the healthcare costs, but we also have a lot of other costs. And if you just take marijuana, for example, we have chronic school children absenteeism. We have the workforce-related costs. We have child abuse and neglect costs. We have congenital defects, which are of children born to mothers exposed to marijuana, and those costs. We have increased costs of auto insurance. In Colorado, it's gone up approximately $40 per driver, and if we had that much costs in Vermont, that would be an extra $20 million that Vermonters would have to spend on industry. So all those costs are there as well, but we're this hour going to primarily focus on healthcare costs. And so with that introduction, we're going to move to Dave Evans, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about what he's learned about the costs from marijuana, commercialization of marijuana, primarily, I think, in Colorado. Dave, are you with us today?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Welcome. It's nice to have you back again. So what can you tell me about what you've learned about the costs of commercialization of marijuana in Colorado?
Well, I've been studying this for several years, and especially this last year when all of the data has been coming out about Colorado and marijuana legalization. And what has happened to our country is that we have an industry that is pretty much unrestrained right now by anybody, and they're getting away with murder, and they're following the playbook of the tobacco and the opiate industry, where they're using a lot of money to promote their product and trying to convince people that it's not dangerous or addictive. Also, the marijuana of today is far different from the marijuana that I smoked back in the 1960s when I was in college. Back then, it was about 2 or 3% THC. Now the products are 99%, 85% THC. It's a completely different drug than it was back then. So let's just take a look at what's been happening to Colorado. Colorado has been portrayed by the marijuana industry as sort of the paradise of pot, that they're doing everything great, and that it's done nothing but benefit everybody. I am concerned about young people. The recent data from Colorado shows that when you look at the suicides of young people from the ages of 10 to 19, when they look at, they do a toxicology report on their bodies, marijuana is the number one drug by far that they are under the influence of at the time they commit their suicide. In Colorado now, sad to say that 1 in 6 infants and toddlers who are hospitalized for lung inflammation are testing positive for marijuana. In other words, they're getting it from their parents through secondhand smoke. That's 1 out of every 6 kids that's hospitalized for this. Marijuana-related emergency room visits by Colorado teams is substantially on the rise, particularly kids showing psychotic symptoms and other mental health problems caused by marijuana. There is a condition called cannabis, I think it's called hyperemesis, which is uncontrolled vomiting from marijuana. And when these people are told that it is marijuana that's causing it, they get angry. And they disagree with the doctor and say the doctor is stupid. We're seeing in Colorado also low birth weights. There has been a 50% increase in low birth weights among women who have used marijuana during pregnancy. Now, this is a terrible thing to visit upon children because it sets the stage for future health problems, including infections, time spent in neonatal intensive care, all of which is hugely expensive. The marijuana industry is not paying for this. We are. We've also seen a general increase in emergency room visits and hospitalizations related to acute marijuana intoxication. As you know, going to the emergency room is very, very expensive. The other problem that we see, which is something that is starting to manifest itself, is that marijuana products have a very high rate of contamination with pesticides, heavy metals, marijuana grow chemicals, and so forth. There have been several studies done in California. Virtually the overwhelming majority of products in California are contaminated with pesticides, and there have been problems in Colorado also with this. Even the states that are, in quotes, regulated, have a regulated marijuana industry, are having trouble with this contamination. It's happened in Washington, California, in Colorado, and in Massachusetts. Massachusetts just closed down a facility because of contamination with pesticides. The biggest damage that we see, and the long-term damage that is going to be visited upon our society for generations, is the impairing of fetal development caused by fetal neurodevelopment caused by both parental and maternal marijuana use. This causes developmental and hyperactivity disorders in children, learning deficits, gaps in problem-solving skills and memory, increased likelihood that the young person will become addicted to other drugs, decreased motor development, birth defects, and childhood cancer. The pediatricians and gynecologists have issued a very stern warning about this. The American Psychiatric Association has also issued a stern warning. The U.S. Surgeon General, the American Academy of Sciences, all have said, and the National Institute of Drug Abuse, all have said that there's a problem with using marijuana during pregnancy and that it causes mental illness. So the marijuana industry is not paying for this. And the problem with taxing the marijuana industry for all of these problems is that if you make the cost of marijuana so high, people will stop buying it at the realtor stores and just go back to their local drug pusher. It is very easy to manufacture marijuana, and where it's harder to manufacture tobacco and alcohol and opiates. And that's precisely what's happening in Colorado. The black market is thriving there, and the tax money is not anywhere near paying for all the damage. So the marijuana industry is getting rich. The money is coming out of your pocket, even though you are not a marijuana consumer.
So what I'm hearing you say is that the arguments for legalization means we're going to get tax money, hasn't really held up, and that we're going to have better quality pot also hasn't really panned out in terms of the legal states have worse quality marijuana than ones that haven't even legalized. So I'll sort of counterintuitive.
It could be, but the big argument is, well, if we tax and regulate it, we'll take it out of the way to the black market. That is not happening. And the other problem is that when you legalize marijuana, it's not just somebody sitting alone on a Saturday night at home smoking a joint. When you legalize it, you also permit the commercialization of it. And the commercialization means that the investors want to make money and they want to expand their market share. They want to hook kids in when they're young, just like the tobacco industry did with those Joe Camel advertisements. They want early on so that they've got a reliable market. They have absolutely no interest in being responsible and trying to get people not to use the substance.
Okay, well, great. Thank you very much, Dave Evans. That's a lot of information in a short period of time. We've got a lot of the other guests lined up today, and I'll let you go with that. But thank you very much for joining us. Our next guest we're privileged to have on the show is Dr. Karen Randall. She is an ER physician from Colorado, and she's seen the experience in Colorado from before it was legal, from when they decriminalized it, when they had medical marijuana, commercialized medical marijuana, and went all the way to legalized, and she's experienced that in Pueblo, Colorado. And so she's going to be able to give us an in-depth look at what she's seen in terms of the costs on the healthcare side of legalized marijuana in her city. So welcome, Dr. Randall.
Oh, thank you. I'm here, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'd like to just talk about our costs that we're seeing in Southern Colorado. I work in the third busiest emergency department in the state, and over the last several years, we've noticed a definitive trend, which hasn't been good, and it's actually alarming. First, I'd like to start by saying I have a disclaimer. I don't make any money by speaking about the marijuana industry or speaking out. When people are talking about the industry and the benefits, you have to ask yourself, are they making money and will they profit from speaking or saying stuff about the industry? I don't make any money and I don't have any financial investments. I'd like to start by saying that we're dispelling a few of the myths. All of the products, the cannabidiol oil, THC, and hemp products, they all come from cannabis sativa. The scientific name is cannabis sativa. There are some variations, but they all come from cannabis sativa. So CBD and THC products are cannabis. There are numerous companies now currently in Colorado, and actually I've seen a lot from across the country that are advertising CBD, and they're advertising that CBD is harmless and has a number of curative powers. Most of the curative powers that are being advertised are actually not founded, and I'm seeing advertisements as far as curing eczema to curing cancer. We know, and we're seeing increased medication interactions with CBD products. We know that probably we'll see more as time goes on. And one of the biggest complications that we're seeing is an interaction with CBD and Coumadin or blood thinning products, because it will extend it and cause or lead to problems with bleeding. When we look at THC, again, echoing what Dave Evans said, the industry has been really irresponsible in creating THC products. Instead of being what we typically think of the Woodstock pod of 1 to 3 milligrams, now we have THC concentrates that can reach up to 90% THC, some even higher. People are consuming these by smoking or vaping when they're doing a dab. THC concentrates are made with harsh chemicals such as butane, propane, etc., that are known to have human side effects without doubt. Also, the THC or the hemp cannabis plant is a pretty good soil scrubber. So it will pick up toxic metals, heavy metals, soil contaminants from soil. And what happens when these contaminants get incorporated to the plant and we concentrate them, we actually concentrate heavy metals and contaminants into the end products, which would be the THC or dabs. Again, an average joint now currently in Colorado is 18 to 22 milligrams of THC. If we do look and compare that to the Woodstock joint, which is 1 to 3 milligrams, we know that today's joint is an average of 9 Woodstock joints. And when we increase the potency, increase the power, we're not reducing harms. There are incredible number of products being made by the companies. You can get anything from THC-infused tampons, THC inhalers, patches, pills, creams, and edibles. And many of these products are designed and meant to deceive. People in Colorado, many of them admit to consuming over now 2,000 to 5,000 milligrams of THC a day, which is a very large amount. Along with a marked increase in usage, we're now seeing a host of medical problems. These problems, as Dave Evans said, include lung problems, psychosis, altered mental states, pediatric ingestions, hyperemesis related to cannabinoids. Additionally, we're going to see long-term problems in children who are children of parents who used cannabis while they were before the kid was delivered. When we look at specific medical issues, we're seeing an increased number of ER visits for problems related to the use of THC and cannabinoids. Perhaps the most disturbing that we see is acute psychosis. And there is no question when we look at today's research that the younger you use and the more you use, the more risk you are for psychosis. We don't know why, but there seems to be an association with schizophrenia, and that pattern is not fully understood, but it seems to precipitate schizophrenia in some people. This psychosis that presents is actually quite frightening. When THC is used in combination with methamphetamines, these people are perhaps some of the most acutely psychotic people that I have seen, and actually are pretty scary, requiring a lot of police attention and are destructive to a community. The medical costs are definitely mounting here in Pueblo, Colorado. We most likely cannot calculate the true cost to the community as a whole. For instance, we have a young person who was exposed to a butane oil explosion. It resulted in greater than 30% second and third degree burns. They were flown from here to the burn center. They required prolonged hospitalization, multiple skin grafts, and they have marked disabilities. So this will lead to a lifetime of disability in this individual. And the cost of that care is really not calculable. How do you cost of medical care alone at the burn center, I'm sure would exceed $1 million, but then add a lifelong disability as well as that. If you look at another cost, a young man who was high on THC had a shootout with police and had multiple GSWs leading to high paralysis, so he's a quadriplegic. His care will be lifelong, and again, his costs are incalculable. Looking at some realistic costs on a daily basis, we see hyperemesis related to cannabinoids. Approximately 10 years ago, this was a case report. It was so rare, but now we're seeing this on at least a daily basis in our community. And these are people who use cannabinoids pretty frequently and are heavy users. We don't know why certain people do have this reaction, but when they do, it's pretty profound. These people often have frequent emergency department visits that lead to sometimes even hospitalization and even renal failure and ICU care. If we look at a typical cost, when we see a patient who comes in with hyperemesis, and I would guess that our emergency department sees at least one patient a day and most likely more than that. It's also termed scromiting because it's a combination of scream vomiting, and the presentations are usually pretty profound. But if we look at the cost of a single ER visit for a person who presents to scromiting, the facility fee, what we charge, is $2,600. The CT cost, because a lot of them get evaluation for abdominal pathology with a CAT scan, is about $3,400. The physician fee is $350. This is a total estimate cost of $6,300. But please be aware that these costs that we're talking about are certainly not what the hospital is being reimbursed. But if you look at an estimated cost of $6,400 and you times that by one a day, that's an annual cost of $2.3 million just for one single diagnosis in one ER. And we have multiple ERs across the state who are looking at the same problem. And this
is great, Dr. Randall. What you're saying is that before 2014, this was a case report. So
probably before 2010.
Before the commercialization of medical marijuana.
Correct. This was so rare that it was a case report, and now we're seeing it daily. And we probably see I know we see at least one case a day, and we probably see more because a lot of times they're coded out as nausea and vomiting and not really hyperemesis.
And you're thinking this is tens of thousands of dollars, if not, as you said, more if they go through the full CT workup. And
Right, and we're just talking about facility fee, CT fee, and physician fee. We aren't talking about the cost of medications. We aren't talking about costs of not being on the job or not being employable. We aren't talking about like the multiple visits that these people have, and this doesn't even touch the cost of hospitalization should they require that. So this is just one small part of a cost that could be incurred by someone with hyperemesis.
is this a frustration for ER physicians? Does it make it difficult for you to maintain your morale, to recruit new ER doctors into your hospital and whatnot? Is this are you spending more money trying to recruit personnel?
This has actually been a real big problem with our area, and it's never been a rich area. And it's always been just on even keel. And of late, we're having a very difficult time recruiting providers. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of drug-related complications and drug-related ER visits, which unfortunately, when someone comes with scromining or the hyperemesis, their presentation is so profound that they get brought back. And they get brought back in preference or deference to the older lady who's sitting with a GI bleed in the waiting room, whose wait time now is 5 to 6 hours. So we've seen more difficulty in getting providers. Our ER wait times have gone up, and we've had a number of community issues that I'll talk about in a little bit. Let's go to slide 12. Now, if we add on like additional costs, I have a story where we saw a young teen using cannabis. He had a psychotic break in an outside state while he was on spring break. That break was so profound that his parents went and brought him back to the state. He was seen in our hospital system. He was hospitalized in our offsite adolescent unit. And at that point, he had another psychotic break. He assaulted 3 healthcare workers. So we're talking about additional costs to the injury to the healthcare workers. Due to the fact that the community is really short on resources, we don't have enough psychiatric beds, we don't have enough rehab, and especially for adolescents, this is a statewide problem. He was released in a couple of weeks. Subsequent to his release, he attacked another person, and that person was so injured that they required ICU care. So those costs are not calculable. And that patient was ultimately sent to jail, and the only thing he ever tested positive for was THC. And this is just one case. So he's had a prolonged adolescent stay. He had multiple ER visits, and he also caused other people to have ER visits. And now, most likely, he won't be productive because he'll be in an institution, either a jail or a psychiatric facility. And so what's the cost of the lost wages for this kid, and what's the cost for one lost person in society? It's pretty hard to calculate all those costs. Let's go to slide 13. If we look at opioid deaths, there's a lot of publication in the media these days saying that marijuana is a great alternative for opioids. The case is not being shown to be true here in Colorado. This is a graph of opioid deaths over time. If you can see towards the end of the graph on the right side, the years 16 and 17, the opioid deaths are skyrocketing. We have a community that has very liberalized THC and marijuana products, and yet our opioid deaths continue to rise. It is, again, as Dave Evans pointed out, it is the #1 drug associated with adolescent completed suicides. It is the #1 diagnosis in adolescent treatment centers is cannabis dependence. And so those costs are, again, mounting here in Colorado. Go to slide 15. Let's talk about some of the community effects that have happened over the last 5 years. Our community in Pueblo is about 110,000 people, and the community in the county is 160,000. In our community of roughly 160,000 people, we have a total of 49 retail cannabis or medical dispensaries. In addition to that, we have over 100 grow sites. So these are legal grow sites. If we look at that per person, that's quite a bit. And the reality is that our community isn't really benefiting. If we look at what we're seeing now, we have a significant problem in our schools with chronic absenteeism. Last year, our chronic absenteeism rate was 27 to 29% in Pueblo District 60, and this year it's 38%. That's over a third of our kids are chronically absent from school. Our school teachers had to strike to get a 2% pay raise. We have no homeless shelter. We actually may have a homeless shelter that's temporary that opened yesterday, but basically we have no long-term homeless shelter. And we also have a huge number of homeless here that we've never seen before. There's been several articles that try to calculate the cost of a homeless person to a community, and roughly the estimate is about $44,000 per year per homeless person when you consider legal costs, police costs, hospital costs, damage to the community costs. It's roughly about 44,000. So even if you increase the community homeless population by 100, you're talking about a significant cost deficit to the community. If we look at Pueblo in specifics, of 110,000 people in Pueblo, about 69,000 of those are on Medicaid. So you can see if this is a huge Medicaid population, it's very hard to get providers to come when the sole population or the good majority of the population is on Medicaid. So we've been losing providers at a rapid rate, and it's been very difficult to recruit people to come in unless they're hospital-based employees. And again, this puts a strain on the hospital. Let's go to slide 16. Let's go back to 15. What we have here in Pueblo is that we've had two hospitals. One of the hospitals that have been here for 132 years had significant financial issues and is now undergoing an overhaul and is basically closed down for all except a few essentials, which has put a tremendous burden on the remaining hospital. And even though we try to staff up, it is very difficult to staff up for the number of drug-related issues that we're seeing. I have done a long-term study looking at all the urine drug screens done in our ER. They're basically done for three reasons: trauma, altered mental status, or psychiatric complaints. And in general, since 2013, not only was it increased in, as we expected, in cannabis use, but all drug usage increased. And in the last 6 months of this year, methamphetamine use along with THC has tripled. So it isn't counteracting any drugs, it is actually increasing drug usage in our community, which leads to increasing hospital resources being dedicated to the people who become severely ill from their drug addiction, and leads to us having difficulty providing actual care and ongoing care to the people of the community who are not using drugs. And then we'll go to the last slide. And so personally, this is what cannabis and legalization of marijuana has meant to me. The community, the industry said that we would have, we'd be able to control illegal grows. There have never, ever been so many illegal grows in Colorado. If you just Google illegal grows in Colorado, it will fill pages of a Google reply. What it personally means is there's the picture on the left is a SWAT team leaving my neighbor's house. I spent 18 years teaching in a large hospital in Detroit, and I never saw a SWAT team coming from my neighbors. This is a known Cuban cartel grow house. It's been busted twice. This was the last time in August. This is a picture I took. The picture in the upper right-hand corner is my brother who lives 90 miles away. The house in the background that's fully involved in fire was also an illegal grow house in his neighborhood. And that's 90 miles away. I had another partner who lived in Parker, Colorado, and her neighbor was an illegal grow. My scribe who lives in Pueblo, her neighbor grows illegally. So you see the likelihood of the four of us having somebody who's an illegal grow next to us it's so prevalent that you see this all the time. Finally, the bottom picture on the right-hand side is a remnant of a homeless camp. We have many homeless camps here in Pueblo. The homeless camps in and of themselves are providing a very difficult and challenging time because we know that there are community problems related simply to the homeless camps. There's been a number of fires. The people are living by our Arkansas River. The E. coli count from the river has never been higher, so we're dealing with those kind of issues as well in the community. So overall, even if we just take a few of the problems that we're seeing related to cannabis and related to expansion of drugs in the community, it's totally overwhelming financially. The community or the industry, the marijuana industry, when we look at gross domestic product for the state of Colorado, is only 0.42% of our GDP. So you can see that totally doesn't add a lot of benefit to this state. When we talk about the cost of this state, it's just almost incalculable.
Okay, well, that was quite a lot of information. Thank you very much, Dr. Randall, for sharing your experience with us. We see that all the promises haven't all come true, and unfortunately, it looks like your community has paid a high price for the commercialization of marijuana in just that little area. We're going to have to stop here. And I'm going to do a little bit on the science of what we know about does marijuana really trigger psychosis or not, and then we're going to talk about what the projected costs are for those psychosis and increased cases of schizophrenia in Vermont. I did hear recently that in Vermont, our ER visits, 80% of ER visits are now for severe mental illness, some sort of mental illness related event. And that obviously was not the case when I trained, for example, 20 years ago. So that's a significant change and related to the amount of marijuana that's out there and the concentrations and the general acceptance that we now have in our society that it's supposedly safe and has no harmful consequences. So I have just a few slides, and they're helpful because the next little bit is science heavy. I start with a quote from Sir Robin Murray. He is a professor of psychiatry. He's one of the highest, most respected scientists and physicians in the field of schizophrenia. He's, I think, third most cited in the world. And he most recently in April of this year has been quoted as saying, "I don't think any serious researcher or psychiatrist would now dispute that cannabis consumption is a component cause of psychosis." So that's really a profound statement. It's something that's really now more and more accepted by certainly the medical community, and I think the general population as well at this point. So let's go on through our slides. The next slide, we'll go through the evidence that we have that marijuana triggers psychotic mental disorders. So what are those? What is that evidence? We know that 12 to 15% of recreational users will report isolated psychotic symptoms like paranoia when they experiment with moderate potency forms of marijuana. And 35% of those with such prodromal symptoms of psychosis can expect to convert to a full-blown spectrum of psychosis if the precipitating factors continue. But the worst statement is that if you have full-blown cannabis-induced psychosis, almost half of people who present to the ER with a full-blown cannabis-induced psychosis will develop schizophrenia. And if you compare that to alcohol-induced psychosis does occur, but it's much more rare. Only about 5% will develop chronic psychosis like schizophrenia with chronic alcohol use. So let's look at the issues of causation from a pharmacological perspective. We've heard this talked about by our own Dr. John Hughes a number of times. And number one, we see a dose-response correlation. So that means with heavier use, more potent products, we see more psychosis. The timing, marijuana use precedes the psychosis, and in prospective studies of teens, that's often something that's seen. Marijuana precedes the psychosis. In individuals who develop schizophrenia who were marijuana users at an earlier stage, that's also evidence that the marijuana is an environmental factor which is contributing to the development of schizophrenia. Marijuana's active ingredient, THC, elicits psychotic symptoms in the laboratory. So if you have a controlled setting of individuals who've used marijuana in the past and you have enough of them, you can elicit psychotic symptoms in the laboratory. Also very good evidence that the THC is the component cause, as Dr. Murray says. In addition, users of other potent recreational drugs developed chronic psychosis less often. For example, PCP users often felt to be a strong hallucinogen, about half of the rate of what we see in marijuana users. So something's going on with THC. And rather than self-medicate, we often see marijuana users with psychosis will try to quit to avoid these symptoms, which are quite unpleasant, hearing voices, seeing hallucinations, whatnot. So one thing that we hear a lot in Vermont is this is just a really small percentage of the population, less than 1%. But when you consider that we've had a series on Vermont Public Radio, This Is Us, we know that mental illness touches so many people in our community right now and in our state. When we have 80% of the admissions to the ER are for a severe mental illness or mental illness precipitated events, we know that it's touching many people in our community. So if that's 10%, if you say 10% of the people have some family member with a severe mental illness, that you're putting 10% of the population at risk. So 10% of the population at risk for the severest of mental illnesses is quite a significant risk. And of course, this is changing daily. So as we move from 2 and 3% THC to a compound that's an extract of 60, 70, 80, up to 90% THC, it's really a different animal. So you're talking about really a new drug, and that's part of the reason we're seeing so much psychosis and schizophrenia, severe mental illness, I guess I should say. And then with heavy genetic loading, there's ample room for environmental factors to make a difference between living a normal life or not. For example, if you have a pair of identical twins and one develops schizophrenia, fully half of the time the other twin will not develop schizophrenia. So we know environmental factors are very profoundly influencing the development of this disease. So psychosis, schizophrenia, and the stigma of increased propensity for violence. There is some evidence that marijuana uniquely leads to violence when we have people who have marijuana, which is triggering their psychosis and schizophrenia. And there's actually quite a lot of literature, but I think I'm going to take a pause right there. And with that background in the science, I'm going to introduce our next guest, who is Dean Whitlock, and he is a health science writer, and he's done a lot of research into this idea of what percentage of people are going to develop some sort of severe mental illness from being exposed to marijuana. This was really brought out of a quote from Sir Robin Murray, in which he said, there are people who would be well, people with schizophrenia who've suffered suicidality, severe depression, who would be well but for their marijuana use. And it was the profound implications of that sentence, I think, that has motivated people like Dean to take a deep dive and look at what are the costs that come from the mental illnesses that are springing out of the use of a new, strong marijuana by a large percentage of the population, motivated by an industry which is interested in, as Bo Kilmer said, producing a product which is 80% is consumed by 20% of the population, an industry interested in creating people with heavy substance abuse disorder.
In your article, Dr. Roberts, I noticed that there was a concern that you had about and observed a psychotic teenage girl who had been dabbing highly concentrated, potent THC. Can you describe a little bit about what that experience was like, not only for you, but also for your patient?
Well, and I'm even going to go beyond that. It's not just the patient, it's everybody else in the ER. So if you
Wow.
can picture this is somebody coming in and most people don't have the clear definition of what it means to be psychotic. That means screaming uncontrollably, taking multiple security guards to hold you down and strap you to the bed, sometimes coming in with a spit mask on. And you have, the nice little old lady next door who might be having a heart attack or a stroke or whatever else she's having is now coming to her door to look and see what's going on because there's somebody just screaming absolutely uncontrollably. And I wish I could tell you that was an isolated experience.
Wow.
That happens, to say daily may be a stretch, but every other day that somebody's being brought in a spit mask and needing to be held down because they're completely psychotic is probably almost daily. There was a young man who was supposed to be on a full-ride football scholarship and had a psychotic break. He was at a sort of a training camp and motivational camp, and while he was there had a completely psychotic break, started driving down the freeway going well over 100 miles an hour. His brother tried to chase him down and luckily got him to the side of the road because the car broke down actually and brought him in, and he he self-reported that he had been dabbing among other things. So again, it's always difficult to say
Right,
if
sure.
that's specifically, but I never saw those cases before. But he had been dabbing, and after the dabbing, I followed up 5 days later, and he was still in the inpatient psychiatric ward, and they couldn't get him to keep his clothes on. And this was somebody who was on a full-ride football scholarship.
So the consequences are vast and
Yeah.
far-reaching.
And that's the
And
thing that most
life-changing.
people don't know about is the psychosis that can come from it. One of the other cases I wrote about in that article was the young man who was seeing ghosts. They're often having very active and vivid hallucinations, and they can run the gambit of what those hallucinations are. And in that specific example was seeing ghosts that told him to kill himself. So he did, and tried 3 times.
Because in middle school, I'd only smoke once a week. That would be a big deal.
When you first start out, you're like, holy shit, I smoked today.
Yeah, because you just get so high. But then the more you smoke, the more your tolerance goes
you're
up,
like,
and
I
then
need to go, yeah.
you need it more to even feel it.
People can stop smoking weed. I could stop smoking weed. It's just a matter of do you really want to? It's just a matter of want, not need, I think. But mooking, I definitely believe that it's a need. It's hard to stop mooking. It's extremely difficult. I've tried it. It's hard on not even mental, because all you think about is wanting to take a mook, but also physically, you know what I mean? You sweat more, you're more agitated, you're more angry, because all you want to do is this release, because the high you get from a mook is totally different than smoking weed.
A mook is when you put tobacco and weed in a bowl and smoke it. So if you've ever smoked a spliff, it's the same thing, but out of a bong. It's intense as fuck. You get a head rush and you just die.
It's like that part on Spaceballs when they go warp speed.
People seize.
Whatever, guys, flying around.
Seizures happen. So I stop, and now I'm just smoking weed, and I get high as fuck because it's great.
Yeah, I've seen multiple people seize.
People started mooking, and everybody was like, oh, it's really gross at first in the first few months of school, and then it progressed, and then by the end of the year, everybody was mooking pretty much.
We went to a mook party at Laurelhurst, and my friend took a mook with spirit, Doha, and nicotine oil on it, and she just lit it and hit it very fat, and then she just kind of started holding her mouth and shaking, and then she went and laid down on the ground and started convulsing and just seizing out, and then we had to kind of help her and get her on her side, that way she could throw up. But then after she threw up, she was fine, and she just came and drank water.
So welcome back. We're continuing the talk about the science of prevention, of effective prevention, and today we're talking about the costs of addiction in our society. And right now, today, I have with me Dean Whitlock, who is a health science writer, and he's written a very important paper which has looked at the question of what is the cost of schizophrenia or severe mental illness due to marijuana use in Vermont, and can we project how that might change as we experience commercialization, more acceptance of marijuana use in Vermont? Will severe mental illness due to marijuana increase?
Well, thank you, Catherine. First, I apologize for the voice. I'm getting over a very bad cold, but luckily feeling better. But I'll work my way through it here. And I want to say that I was a co-author, and it's definitely not the senior author on this. Working with me was Dr. Christine Miller, who was a retired pharmacologist with a focus in neuroscience, and she spent most of her career doing research at Johns Hopkins. And she's been published in dozens of peer-reviewed magazines and has been a reviewer for the magazines as well, Schizophrenia Bulletin, Journal of Neuroscience, and other very, very important magazines or journals in the field. She's the one who did the heavy lifting. Like you say, I'm a writer. I have a background in psychology and biology from college, and since 2009 I've been working in the public health field, specifically having to do with the field of substance abuse prevention. Since 2013 I've been focusing on marijuana. And we hooked up in 2015. She wanted to write this article. She wanted to get it out quickly because of what was going on. So rather than try to wait for the couple of years that it takes to get an article accepted and ready for a journal, we decided to bring it out as a white paper. Though the results would have been the same whether we had waited or not. And there's a long list of citations in there of the research that she called upon to bring this together. Essentially what we did was we looked at the RAND report that had come out in 2015. And it predicted a certain growth in use if we were to commercialize marijuana, legalize it, but also make it available in dispensaries for retail sale, recreational use, as they call it. And there were a couple of scenarios. One scenario where we weren't able to undersell the black market, and they predicted that fewer people then would switch over. You'd see a smaller number of users. And then there was the second scenario in which we were able to undersell the black market, and that showed a higher number of users. So we were looking at like a 25% increase in use rate or a 54% increase in use rate. And based on what's happened in Colorado, Oregon, Washington, Massachusetts, well, has already happened because of their very, very permissive medical marijuana, but they'll see more of it. And Vermont would see more of it too. What we've seen is something that's in between, but among young adults, which is to say 18 to 25 years old, we're seeing 65%, 70% increase in use rate. The 12 to 18-year-olds, a very important group because they're so susceptible to the effects, we're not seeing as much, but just this past week, the new Monitoring the Future results came out showing a 10%, a statistically significant 10% increase in use rate among that age group. So what did we find? We found that calculating our current economic burden for schizophrenia, and there is research that shows how much it costs to treat a patient each year with schizophrenia, which is admittedly the most severe form of psychosis. But still, as you said, as we've seen the figures, a lot of people who develop the psychosis will go on to develop the schizophrenia. Looking at that current burden and then adding to it either the 25% increase we would expect under the one scenario up to the 54% increase in the other scenario, we saw that we would expect to see an increase from $4.9 million per year extra healthcare cost up to $11.1 million per year in extra healthcare costs. And this is in 2015 dollars. Okay. We'd have to adjust for inflation now on that. We also have to consider the fact that since decriminalization in Vermont, and we don't have the data yet for legalization of just last July, but since decriminalization, we've seen a statistically significant increase in use rates among the 18 to 25-year-olds, but also in all age groups,
right,
including the underage group.
Right. So when we started thinking about decrim, almost everyone was for it. It was very difficult to find someone who was against decrim in 2013. And what we heard a lot was, don't worry, that's not going to change our use rates. We're going to just it's a harm reduction method. And I think the Medical Society and various other pediatricians said, well, we need to get out in front of this and we need to do some education ahead of time. But that wasn't done. And so, as you said, the reuse rates did increase, unfortunately. And I think I've seen those statistics from the Vermont Health Department, and they show that the segments of our population in Vermont who've been most hurt were those who earned less than $25,000 a year, or those who had less than 12th grade education. So we did decrim, which we thought was a harm reduction, and we've hurt the least among us. So that was an unintended consequence, which is from decreased perception of harm.
Right. And another issue about this is that in 2015, we were looking at potencies that range from about 12% up to about 15% marijuana. And as we heard now, this is not just the extracts we're talking about. This is the smokable marijuana. This is the leaves, the buds, the flowers. We're talking that over 20% marijuana is the standard fare in Colorado and Washington and Oregon. Under the legalization regime, they have been able to increase and increase. And these high-strength potencies were first developed in the Netherlands under their relaxed tolerance of decriminalization with the coffee shops. So we can expect this to increase. I'm not sure how it could go much higher, but we can expect to see an increase in potency. And there is this dose-response relationship. The higher strength marijuana is not being used more lightly, it's being used more heavily.
That's
so
correct.
The heavy users of today are much heavier users than they were back when I was in college and tried marijuana.
Right.
So it's a very different beast.
And we did hear from the commission, the governor's commission, recently, and the health commission has come out and said unanimously that we should not have any edibles because of their link to psychosis and schizophrenia and various other mental illnesses. But that hasn't been completely embraced.
No, in fact, it has been rejected. One of the problems with politicians is that once they come out and make statements, somehow they're not allowed to change their minds. And I consider myself to be a liberal who has changed his mind. I'm a progressive liberal. I'd like to see there be universal health care. We won't be able to afford it because of the substance abuse burden, not just marijuana.
Right.
But all the substances.
Right, like Dr. Randall was talking about.
Yes,
that
exactly.
They thought, okay, well, if we legalize or liberalize marijuana, we may see an increase in marijuana use. But what she's seen in her data and her ER is, my goodness, an increase in methamphetamines, and even her Colorado opiate, death rates have continued to increase each year. So all of the objectives haven't been fulfilled, unfortunately, and the
Not
costs are laid for us to bear.
Right. And again, this whole idea of tax and regulate is based on not increasing the user rate and not increasing the amount of money that is going to be paid for this stuff. And that's simply not going to happen if it becomes a commercialized system.
Right. We had a talk at the health department. We had Jonathan Calkins was invited by Mark Levine to come and give a lecture, and his point was that if we had illegal toasters in Vermont, or an illegal industry of coats or rugs or cars or cameras, and we wanted to bring that gray market up to make it legal, when we did that, there would likely not be a 400% increase in the appetite for toasters or coats or cars. There might be a little bit, but not.
Right.
But this is the point of this presentation and this series of talks, is that the industry of addiction is a different animal. So the industry of addiction doesn't operate, there's no profit to be made unless their widget is someone who has a use disorder. Yes. They want to create that person, and that's what's fueling the findings in your paper. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And as one thing that Christine Miller said, that if we had the evidence we have now for the schizophrenia connection, the psychosis connection, if we had that sort of evidence about genetically modified products, foods, we wouldn't be discussing labeling. We would have taken them off the market. We have disallowed them by now. But unfortunately, there's a strong industry lobby out there that is spreading disinformation and is trying to convince people that we're going to have billions of dollars flowing into our well from selling this addictive substance. And we aren't. It's not going to flow into our well.
That's right.
It won't.
That's right.
And unfortunately, we have to argue against it as best we can.
That's right. Well,
But again, if you follow the science, which is what the proponents were begging that we do when I first got involved, front page of the Marijuana Policy Project website was, let us have a science-based discussion. It's not there anymore. They took it down 3 years ago.
Really?
Because if we followed the science, they would lose.
that's right. I mean, we know from tobacco that candy cigarettes that don't even have nicotine in them are a useful tool to addict children to nicotine later on in life. And we got rid of those, right? We made them illegal, unacceptable.
That's right.
They're banned. But now we have gummy bears for children, right? I mean, there's no other reason to really make a gummy bear, a sweet red gummy bear that even has the active addictive substance in it.
And it's not just the children's stuff. As our experience with tobacco and alcohol has shown, if you want to reduce use rates, you have to reduce adult rates first. It's a follow the leader proposition. And we got billions of dollars from the tobacco industry after we sued their pants off to try to get use rates down. And we did that throughout the population by essentially vilifying tobacco.
Right.
And so nobody wants to go into a restaurant now where people are smoking. They don't even want to walk past the smokers standing outside the door.
Right.
But we're not doing that with marijuana. We're going the other way. We're increasing the use rate of adults. And therefore, the use rate of kids will go up.
And
that's a given.
Absolutely, and of course, it's very important to realize that it was impossible to do any of the reduction in tobacco until we were able to, I don't know if the word is convict, but they were found guilty of racketeering. That means in a closed brick building in Durham, North Carolina, with the shades down, they had the smartest guys in the room, marketing and scientists and neuroscientists, trying to figure out what Joe Camel would be most appealing to how many kids, and what combination of nicotine on the leaves would be most addictive to children. And that all in the face of knowing that they were killing 400,000 people every year and continuing to do it. And so it's that knowing that there's a problem and still continuing to market to children. And unfortunately, because of the appetite for profit, we're seeing that again with the marijuana industry. Just an example, the for-profit medical marijuana industry in Colorado, there was a recent study in, I think it was JAMA, 70% of medical marijuana shops are so interested in profit that they will tell a pregnant lady that it's okay to smoke marijuana while she's pregnant. I mean, that's just...
And you have to understand, too, that most of the bud tenders are not trained pharmacists. They are not in the scientists. They do believe that it will help.
Right.
It's the people who are their bosses that are not telling them to stop.
Right. So I want to give you all the time you need, and then we have someone who's been adversely affected personally by the marijuana industry, targeting her child, and she wants to tell that experience.
Well, I don't have too much else to say except to repeat that the data that we have linking psychosis and schizophrenia to marijuana use is as solid as any we have linking tobacco to cancer. And we know that the higher strengths lead to worse effects. There's a dose-response relationship here. We have to pay attention to that. We have to address not just the kids, but the adults as well. And that there's no way the tax money will pay for operational costs, enforcement costs, education costs, health costs, traffic accident costs. And by health costs, it's not just the psychosis, it's the mania and bipolar disease, it's social anxiety disorder. It is the link now that is growing stronger and stronger with more and more research all the time, the link now between suicide and marijuana, and the link between co-drug use. Again, the Monitoring the Future found vaping has gone up, marijuana use has gone up, and kids are using tobacco and marijuana together.
Yes, yes, and that's what this show is also going to have that clip from the film from a high school student from Portland, Oregon, who did an independent film in his high school, and shows that kids who are using marijuana and tobacco together are actually seizing, and this is new information. It's almost every physician that I show that clip to says, "Wow, I learned something. Kids can seize from high potency THC combined with nicotine." So we'll have that as part of it so that the audience can see those clips as well. So we'll turn to Aubrey. Welcome, Aubrey, and thank you for being willing to share your experience with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a very important topic, and this issue affects so many other issues. I was really appreciative of what Dean just said about healthcare. If we're addicting more people and we're causing more problems, we're not going to have the money to give healthcare, to afford healthcare for everybody. And that's what I keep scratching my head about. Why is our country doing this to our people? We want a healthy country and we want everybody to have healthcare, but there's no way we can afford more mental illness and addiction. So I really appreciate that. Did you just want me to talk, Catherine, or?
So we've heard providers, we've heard lawyers, we've heard researchers talk about what they've found in figures, but you've experienced it firsthand. We do have an anonymous writer who's written in a Vermont newspaper, and I think that perspective would give the audience an idea of what it feels like to be touched by marijuana-induced mental illness or illness.
Sure, I'll start with that letter, and then I'll talk a little bit about what it costs my family and my community. So this is an anonymous letter from a Vermonter, and he starts and he says, "When you praise the personal freedom and beneficial tax receipts designed for legalization of marijuana, you must also count the unintended consequences that occur because of it, like the 5 teenagers lifeless on the interstate because of a driver impaired on marijuana. The dad who, while under the influence of THC, leaped out of a multi-story building holding his infant child. It encompasses the growing burden put on the ER department, our sons and daughters, who were well on their way to contribute greatly to society before marijuana and triggered their mental psychosis. They were pre-med students. They were valedictorians. A few wanted to serve this country via the military. Some were too young to have career ambitions before marijuana triggered them into the whirling diverse of mental illness. All too many could not cope with their triggered mental illness and willfully committed suicide, while others succumbed to overdoses. Family members have spent life savings in hopes of incurring onset marijuana-induced schizophrenia, spending thousands on court fees, attorneys, private investigators to locate their missing young adults. We've set our retirement dreams to the wind. These are the real stories that are never seen on national news. And that letter breaks my heart, and I can relate on so many levels. And my son is only 18 years old, but it started when he was 14. And financially, I can tell you it cost me about $70,000 a year. Not a year, I'm sorry, $70,000 since we started when he was 14. That's not including what the state of Colorado has already paid. They paid a home therapist $2,500 for 8 months of treatment within our home, and they paid $5,500 a month for 3 months for a 90-day residential treatment program. And that's not including all the meds and everything that went with it. I can tell you I currently still owe $25,000 for treatment, and my monthly payments on all the programs that my son is part of cost me $850 a month. And I've been paying that fee and it just went down to $850. I was paying between $1,000 and $1,200 a month for the past 2 years while he's been in an intensive outpatient program, an alternative peer group, and adventure learning program. Every ounce, every penny I have spent has been worth it. I have no savings. I live paycheck to paycheck, and I'm considered middle class. I would like to tell your viewers and the people of Vermont and the policymakers of Vermont, the poor families, some of those children don't stand a chance because the families do not have the resources at all. I'm a pretty stubborn mom. I fought really hard to continue to find treatment, and when one door closed, another one would open. There was a period of time during my son's addiction, mental health cycles that I had walked away from my job. I could not trust him to be in the home alone with my younger son. I could not trust community members not giving him marijuana. So I was at home and walked away from my job, and he was relapsing and still suicidal at times. And every time I would take him to the ER, it would cost me between $500 and $800. And I was looking for treatment, even though he had already been in a psych unit twice and had the 90-day treatment program with the Department of Social Service, plus the 8 months of a home therapist. There was a period of time he was on the streets, gone for up to 5 days. And I had found a treatment center in Utah. Utah is full of treatment centers. And they said I could come. I had private insurance. So they said, you can bring him. And we had done an intervention with the ER staff, and he accepted that he needed help and was willing to go. And it was a working cattle ranch he was going to go to. And I had went and got him the clothes and everything he needed. And the night before we were supposed to leave, the executive director called me and said, unless you have $36,000, you can't bring him. Mm. And I didn't have it. I think I had a couple $100 in my checking account at that point. So once my son, he was pretty sick at that point, vomiting a lot, only testing positive for marijuana. He was very thin. When he started feeling better and he knew I didn't have the money to send him anywhere, he was back on the street. Mm. So the financial burden is not only to society, but it breaks the families. And there's no savings left. There's nothing left, though the families are willing to spend whatever it takes to get your child treatment and get them healthy. The monthly fees I pay for the programs even now is because I am so committed to him being healthy, and he is stabilized, and he is doing well, and he's progressing well. He is not in high school. He will probably eventually get a GED. But his education, his academic education, is put aside, where his main priority is his health, his mental health, and learning how to contribute to society and serve society. So I appreciate the opportunity of giving a perspective of a family. I have families call me all the time asking me for help and saying they don't have the money. There's lots of treatment programs that have popped up that are taking advantage of these vulnerable families, telling them they need to pay them thousands of dollars to help their child, and they end up being a scam. So they're feeling there's people making money off addiction and mental health, not just in the marijuana industry, but unfortunately, to get the bad actors in the recovery community too.
I guess I also wanted to add, we tried to invite a Vermonter who's been affected, and there's quite a stigma. And we had one person lined up, and they were embarrassed and didn't want to expose their loved one. And I think that in Vermont we have less stigma around addiction. We're working very hard on that. We have less stigma around mental illness, but marijuana-induced mental illness, I don't see people coming out and speaking about that publicly. It feels like, in Vermont, there's duct tape on a whole community of people, and I don't completely you know, I can surmise about why that may be, but it is unfortunate. I think that it partly has to do with an extremely powerful industry in Vermont, which is marketing marijuana as healthy, as marketing marijuana as good for the economy, and that if you say anything, you know, that, well, it caused severe mental illness to my loved one, and my whole family was affected, you know, economically, psychologically, or whatever. You know, you're not cool.
I don't think it's just in Vermont, because I have a family connection in Massachusetts where one of the family members started using marijuana to deal with other issues, self-medicating, and it made all of them worse, became an addiction, and the rest of the family didn't learn about this for a long time, because there is a certain amount of shame involved in substance use addiction. And it's been seen for generations as a moral failing, and it's something that we are trying as a society to come to grips with, to understand that it's not a moral failing, it's actually a physical thing that happens. Marijuana is just as physically addictive as it is psychologically addictive, and so are all those other drugs. And we're ashamed of that. We're ashamed of mental illness. It's a weakness that we try to cover up. It's absolutely endemic with our society. And I'm sure Aubrey experienced it as much as we did here in Vermont. And, you know, we aren't upfront about this.
No, we aren't.
And we don't admit to it. And the state institutionalizes that by not putting forth enough money to deal with it.
Or even to educate.
Yes.
I mean, I mean, it is true that this idea that marijuana causes psychosis is relatively new. I remember in 2013 being in the State House and saying, you know, to David Zuckerman, you know, I think this is the problem. I think you should pay attention to this. And the response I got was, I don't think that's a real thing, or it was going to happen anyway, or it's such a small group of people. And I think the other thing that comes up for this is we're getting a lot of traction in the State House and in the state in general about this idea about ACEs, so adverse child events, which have such profound impact on a person's, you know, whether they develop cancer, whether all these other, you know, psychological problems, or what they're going to earn and how happy they're going to be long term in their life and whatnot. What we know now is that if someone in your family develops severe mental illness, you have 5 people who've then been affected by a severe ACEs event. And so as we go forward, as the industry makes this more acceptable and plays down the negative costs or the negative ramifications, as they did with tobacco, we're going to have more and more innocents impacted by someone in their family who's been hurt.
That's right. And I really appreciate you both bringing light to the stigma. I agree. It is a nationwide thing, and it's a messaging that the Drug Policy Alliance and the marijuana proponents have just completely manipulated the country into thinking marijuana is harmless, and the people that are mentally ill do have some kind of moral problem. I was so desperate after I didn't have the $38,000 to take my son to that treatment center. I made a GoFundMe page, and I thought, there's got to be somebody out there that's wealthy that understands addiction and mental illness, and they're gonna fund me. They're gonna you know, contribute to this. So when I made the fundraiser, and I keep it up there still, and I think I asked for $80,000 on my fundraiser because they told me my son would be there a year or more, and it was I think it was $12,000 a month, right, that they were charging. And then the pro-marijuana people came after me, and they wrote awful, awful things to me, and they called me a liar. And I had grown some pretty thick skin by then because I had pretty much lost a lot of my friends. I don't, you know, because of the stigma, but also because your friends are very uncomfortable about what's happening, and they look at you as a bad parent too. I mean, like, nobody was bringing me casseroles or anything, or having like a spaghetti fundraiser to help, you know, or anything like that. You do become isolated. So there's a lot of families out there that are suffering in silence are not even realizing that marijuana is the root of the cause of their problems. So there's a few parents like me that do speak up. Most of the parents that contact us don't want to speak up because of the stigma and just being embarrassed about it, and because of the harassment they get. That is the main reason. I've had parents that are willing to speak up, but they just say, I can't do this anymore. It's causing me so much stress. I just want to live a quiet, happy life. And also, when you talk about the trauma that comes along with it, there was a moment when a police officer was in my home counseling my son and me about what was happening. And the officer looked over at me and he said, Mrs. Adams, you really have to watch your younger son. What happens with these families, when one child goes down this road, the other child gets lost, and they end up being suicidal, severely depressed, and stuff like that. And that is true. My younger son has developed depression and anxiety, and he is actually part of the recovery community here where I live in Houston, even though he doesn't have a substance abuse problem. So that's a big warning to families, that are going through this.
Right.
Make sure you're looking at all your kids and making sure that not only you're getting treatment for the one with the substance abuse problem, but the other kids, too, that are experiencing all this trauma. It's such a snowball effect on our society.
Correct. Well, thank you very much, Aubrey, for contributing that. I think that, that's really gets us back to the theme of our series, which is prevention, science of effective prevention. And we really need to focus on the Icelandic model focuses on the environment. It's non-judgmental. It doesn't expect children to have to say no. It really expects parents to step up and create a healthy environment. And for that, we need the resources that are now slipping through our fingers because we have an avarice industry which is targeting the children as they're popped into the world. And that's something that we'd like to increase the awareness of and hopefully get people engaged. So thank you very much for joining us. I hope this has been informative and helpful. And as always, we look forward to your feedback. And thank you. Thanks, Dean.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
Aubrey.
Thank you.
Bye, Aubrey. Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thank
Bye.
you.